struggling cowboy, saved a baby from bandits. Unaware it carried the sheriff's bloodline, Jack Merritt thought he'd seen every kind of hell the desert could serve up, until he heard a baby crying among the dead. The desert had been lying to Jack Merritt for 3 days straight, promising water where there was none, shade where only stone waited, and hope where only dust remained. His horse, a gray mare named Dolly, picked her way through the canyon with the careful steps of an animal that knew better than to trust the promises of this wretch. Jack pulled his hat low against the afternoon sun and felt the familiar ache in his belly that came with riding on empty. 2 days since his last meal. 4 days since his last honest work. The silver dollar in his pocket felt heavier than a gravestone, the only thing standing between him and the kind of desperation that made good men do evil things. That's when he heard the thunder. But thunder didn't roll uphill, and thunder didn't come with the sound of men shouting and horses screaming. Jack reined Dolly to a stop and listened to the wind carry violence up from the valley below. Gunshots cracked like dry wood in a fire, sharp and fast and final. He should have turned around, should have pressed his heels into Dolly's sides and ridden north toward Flagstaff, where honest work might still be found for a man willing to break his back for it. Should have minded his own business and left whatever was happening down there to sort itself out the way things always did in the territory, with blood and silence, and the desert taking what it would. Instead, Jack dismounted and crawled to the canyon's edge. The wagon train stretched below him like broken teeth. 3 families, maybe 4, their canvas covers torn and smoking. The oxen lay where they'd fallen, some still twitching in the dust. Bodies were scattered between the wheels and water barrels, and Jack could see from the way they'd fallen that it had happened fast. Too fast for prayers or last words or anything but the kind of fear that follows a man into whatever comes after. 3 riders moved among the wreckage like carrion birds, their faces hidden beneath bandanas. They worked with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, turning over bodies and rifling through belongings with practiced hands. One of them, a tall man in a black duster, kicked over a water barrel and cursed when nothing but muddy liquid spilled into the sand. Jack watched them work and felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd seen raids before, knew the difference between desperate men taking what they needed and men who killed for the pleasure of it. These weren't hungry drifters or broken soldiers still fighting a war that had ended years ago. These were predators, and they found easy prey in the families brave enough or foolish enough to believe the territory would let them pass through safely. The tall one in the duster mounted his horse and shouted something Jack couldn't make out. The other 2 followed, spurring their mounts hard toward the eastern pass. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only dust and silence and the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like a curse. Jack should have waited longer, should have made sure they weren't coming back. But something pulled him down into that valley, something stronger than common sense or self-preservation. Maybe it was the way the wind moved through the torn canvas, or the way the shadows were already growing long across the dead. Maybe it was just the knowledge that no man should die alone under the desert sky, without someone to bear witness. He led Dolly down the narrow trail, his boots sliding on loose stone. The smell hit him first, blood and fear and the sweetness of spilled flour mixing with the dust. Then the flies, black and busy, already claiming their share of what remained. Jack moved through the wreckage with his hat in his hands, counting the dead. A man with gray whiskers shot through the chest. A woman in a blue dress, face down near the overturned cooking pot. 2 children, a boy and a girl, lying close together as if they'd tried to protect each other at the end. He was looking for survivors when he heard it. The sound was so small, so fragile, that at first he thought it was the wind whistling through a bullet hole in the wagon boards. But the wind didn't cry with such perfect, heartbreaking rhythm. The wind didn't call out for comfort in a voice that had never known cruelty. Jack followed the sound to the last wagon, where a young woman lay twisted beneath the driver's seat. Her brown hair was matted with blood, and her eyes stared at nothing. But in her arms, wrapped in a blanket that had somehow stayed clean despite everything, was a baby. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old. It had dark hair like its mother and eyes the color of summer sky, and it looked up at Jack with the kind of trust that made grown men remember what it felt like to believe in something good. The baby's face was red from crying, but when Jack reached down with gentle hands, the crying stopped. "Well, little one," Jack whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Looks like it's just you and me now." He lifted the child carefully, the way a man handles something precious and fragile. The baby weighed nothing at all, but Jack felt the weight of it settle into his bones like he'd never held a child before, never had cause to learn the careful way of cradling a life so small it could fit in the span of his 2 hands. The woman, the baby's mother, had died trying to shield her child with her own body. Jack could see that from the way she'd fallen, the way her arms had formed a protective circle even in death. He knelt beside her and gently closed her eyes, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since he was young enough to believe God was listening. "Your baby's safe," he told her still form. "I give you my word on that." The promise hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jack looked around at the scattered belongings, torn photographs, broken dishes, a child's wooden horse lying in the sand. These had been good people, he could tell. The kind who said grace before meals and read from the Bible on Sundays and believed that hard work and honest living would see them through to better days. Now, they were just memories and dust. Jack wrapped the baby tighter in its blanket and stood slowly, his knees creaking like old leather. Dolly whickered softly when she saw him approaching with the bundle, as if she understood that their lives had just changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls the color of dry blood. Jack knew he needed to move, needed to get the baby somewhere safe before the desert cold settled in. But first, he walked back to each of the bodies and spoke their names aloud, the names he read from torn letters and family Bibles scattered in the wreckage. Samuel Morrison, age 42. Mary Morrison, beloved wife. Little Thomas and Sarah Morrison. His voice carried across the empty canyon. "You died brave, and you won't be forgotten." He found a shovel among the scattered tools and spent the last hour of daylight digging graves in the hard earth. It wasn't much, but it was what he could give them, what he owed them for the gift they'd unknowingly left in his care. As stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Jack mounted Dolly with the baby secured against his chest. The child had fallen asleep, its tiny fist curled around a button on Jack's worn shirt. The sight of it, so peaceful, so trusting, made something inside Jack's chest crack open like ice in spring. He'd been drifting for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose beyond his next meal or his next job. But now, with this small life depending on him, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. It was heavy, but it was good weight, the kind that reminded a man he was still alive, still capable of doing right by someone who needed him. The night wind whispered through the canyon as they rode north toward Copper Creek, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Behind them, the graves lay silent under the stars, and ahead of them waited a future that neither Jack nor the sleeping child could yet imagine. But for now, in this moment between darkness and dawn, between death and whatever came next, they had each other. And sometimes, Jack thought as he adjusted the blanket around the baby's face, sometimes that was enough to build a new life on. The hardest man in Copper Creek was brought to his knees by 8 pounds of crying baby, and he didn't even know whose child he was protecting. The cabin had never felt smaller. Jack stood in the doorway at dawn, holding the baby against his chest, while morning light crept through the gaps in the wooden walls. 3 rooms that had seemed plenty spacious for a man, and his solitude now felt cramped and dangerous, full of sharp edges and hard surfaces that could hurt something so small and trusting. The child had cried through most of the night, not the angry crying of a spoiled child, but the desperate, hungry wailing of an infant who knew something was terribly wrong with the world. Jack had walked the floor until his boots wore smooth paths in the dust, bouncing the baby and making soft sounds that felt foreign in his throat. "You hungry, little one?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, its tiny fists waving weakly. "I reckon we both are." He found a wooden crate that had held canned peaches and lined it with his cleanest shirt. The baby looked impossibly small lying there, like a bird fallen from its nest. Jack touched the child's cheek with one rough finger, marveling at skin so soft it felt like warm silk. The ride to Copper Creek took an hour, and every minute away felt like abandoning a piece of his soul. But the baby needed milk, needed proper blankets, needed things that Jack's empty cabin couldn't provide. Copper Creek sprawled in the valley like a collection of weathered bones. The main street ran straight between two rows of false-fronted buildings, all painted the same sun-bleached gray. Jack tied Dolly to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and steeled himself for the questions that would surely come. The bell chimed as he stepped inside, and Edgar Morrison looked up from his ledger with suspicious eyes. "Jack Merritt," Morrison said, his voice flat. "Ain't seen you in a month." "Need some things," Jack replied, moving toward the shelves. "Milk for a baby, and cloth for diapers." Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Baby? You got yourself married, Jack." "Something like that." Jack laid his last silver dollar on the counter, watching Morrison's expression shift from suspicion to curiosity to something that might have been respect. It was more money than Jack usually spent in a year. Morrison gathered the supplies without further questions, but Jack could feel the man's eyes following his every movement. By the time he loaded the goods into his saddlebags, half the town would know that the drifter cowboy had bought baby milk with real silver. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than the ride out. Jack kept thinking about the baby waiting in that wooden crate, alone and helpless. What if something had happened while he was gone? What if the child needed him and he wasn't there? But when he pushed open the cabin door, the baby was sleeping peacefully, one tiny fist curled near its face. Jack felt something tight in his chest loosen, like a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The next few days blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and tentative discoveries. Jack learned how to mix the powdered milk with water warmed over the fire. He learned how to change diapers without getting kicked by surprisingly strong little legs. He learned that babies cried for reasons beyond hunger, sometimes for comfort, sometimes for company, sometimes just because the world was too big and strange and they needed to be held. The hardest lesson was the tenderness. Jack's hands had known only rough work for 40 years, roping cattle, chopping wood, handling firearms. Now those same hands had to learn the gentle art of washing a baby's face, of supporting a wobbly head, of offering comfort through touch. The first time the baby's fingers curled around his thumb, Jack felt something break open inside his chest that he didn't have words for. He found himself talking to the child as he went about his daily tasks, his voice growing softer with each passing day. "Your mama was a brave woman," he would say while heating milk over the fire. "I could tell from the way she protected you. She loved you something fierce." The baby would look at him with those blue eyes that seemed to hold all the sky, and Jack would feel the weight of promises he'd made to a dead woman in a canyon full of graves. On the fourth day, Jack realized he was humming. It was an old song his mother had sung when he was small, something about angels watching over sleeping children. He thought he'd forgotten it, thought those memories had been buried along with everything else from his childhood. But the melody came back like water, finding its way downhill, natural and inevitable. The baby seemed to like it. Those blue eyes would focus on Jack's face whenever he hummed, and sometimes the crying would stop, replaced by a peaceful quiet that felt like grace. But peace in Copper Creek was a fragile thing. On his second trip to Morrison's store, Jack noticed the way conversations stopped when he walked in, the way folks glanced at each other with knowing looks, the way their eyes followed him as he bought more milk, more cloth, more of the things a man needed when he was caring for a child. "Heard tell there's been some trouble on the eastern trails," Morrison said as he counted Jack's coins. "Wagon train went missing about a week ago. Families from back east, heading for California." Jack kept his face still, but his heart hammered against his ribs. That's so. Sheriff Caldwell's been asking questions. Real worried about it, from what I hear. Lost his own daughter and son-in-law in an Apache raid last year. Reckon he takes missing families personal now. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Caldwell. He knew that name, knew the reputation that came with it. Thomas Caldwell had been wearing a badge in the territory for 15 years, and he was the kind of lawman who didn't give up on anything. If Caldwell was looking for survivors from that wagon train, any word on what happened to them? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Morrison shook his head. Nothing yet. But the sheriff's got riders out searching every canyon and creek bed between here and Tucson. He'll find something, you can bet on that. A man like Caldwell doesn't let go of things easy. Jack paid for his supplies and left the store with Morrison's words echoing in his head. Outside, he noticed a man he didn't recognize sitting on the saloon steps, someone with the look of a deputy about him, the way he watched everyone who passed with careful, measuring eyes. The ride back to the cabin felt like traveling through a dream that might turn into a nightmare at any moment. Jack found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see riders following his trail. But the desert remained empty except for the wind and the shadows of clouds moving across the redstone. The baby was awake when he returned, making soft cooing sounds and moving its tiny hands like it was reaching for something only it could see. Jack picked the child up and felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the feeling that had no name but felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. We might have some trouble coming, little one, he whispered into the baby's soft hair. But don't you worry none. I ain't letting anybody hurt you. As he spoke the words, Jack realized he meant them with a fierceness that surprised him. This child had become more than just a responsibility. It had become the center of everything. The reason his days had meaning and his nights had purpose. He'd found something worth protecting, and he'd die before he let anyone take it away. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the canyon and the first drops of rain began to fall, Jack sat by the fire with the baby sleeping in his arms. The child's breathing was soft and steady, and its small weight felt like an anchor holding him to something good and real. Thunder rolled across the desert, and Jack wondered if Sheriff Caldwell was out there somewhere in the darkness, following cold trails and broken dreams. He wondered what kind of man would search so hard for strangers, what kind of heart could carry that much hope after losing so much. But mostly he wondered how long he could keep this secret before the weight of it crushed them both. When Sheriff Caldwell walked into that saloon asking about his missing grandson, Jack Merritt felt his whole world crack down the middle. The sheriff rode into Copper Creek on a Tuesday morning when the dust hung thick as grief in the still air. Jack saw him coming from his seat outside the saloon, where he'd been nursing a cup of coffee and watching the baby sleep in a makeshift carrier he'd fashioned from leather and rope. The lawman sat his horse like a man carved from stone, his back straight and his eyes scanning the street with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime looking for trouble. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell was older than Jack had expected, maybe 60, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. But there was nothing soft about him. His badge caught the morning sun like a mirror, and the Colt on his hip rode easy in its holster, the gun of a man who knew how to use it and wasn't afraid to prove it. Jack felt his mouth go dry as dust. The baby stirred against his chest, making the soft sounds that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Jack instinctively adjusted the blanket to hide the child's face, though he couldn't have said why. Some animal instinct warned him that being seen with a baby right now might raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. Caldwell dismounted and tied his horse to the post with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness. When he stepped onto the boardwalk, his spurs rang like funeral bells against the weathered wood. Jack stood slowly, cradling the baby, and made his way toward the general store. But he could hear Caldwell's voice drifting from the saloon, low and urgent, asking questions that made Jack's blood run cold. Looking for information about a wagon train, the sheriff was saying. 3 families, maybe 4. They were headed west through the Painted Desert about 10 days ago. Name of Morrison, and there was a young woman named Ellen Caldwell traveling. Jack stopped walking. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and he had to put a hand against the store's wall to steady himself. Caldwell, Ellen Caldwell. The baby's mother had been a sheriff's daughter. Through the saloon's batwing doors, Jack could see Caldwell talking to a group of men clustered around a table. The sheriff's voice carried the weight of a man holding himself together through pure will, but Jack could hear the cracks in it, the places where hope and desperation bled through. Ellen was traveling with her husband and their baby. Caldwell continued. My grandson, 6 months old, with dark hair and blue eyes. If anything's happened to them. The sheriff's voice broke, just for a moment, and Jack heard 40 years of pain condensed into that single pause. This wasn't just a lawman doing his job. This was a grandfather searching for the last piece of his family, the only blood he had left in the world. Jack looked down at the baby sleeping against his chest, at those dark lashes and that perfect little mouth, and felt his heart crack open like a stone hit by lightning. This child wasn't just some orphan he'd rescued from bandits. This was Thomas Caldwell's grandson, the son of Ellen Caldwell, who died trying to protect the baby with her own body. The sheriff had been searching for his family for 10 days, not knowing that his grandson was sleeping safely in a cabin just 5 miles outside town. The weight of that knowledge settled on Jack's shoulders like a millstone. He should walk into that saloon right now, should hand the baby over to its rightful family and explain what he'd found in that canyon. Should let the sheriff hold his grandson and know that at least one precious thing had survived the massacre. But Jack's feet stayed rooted to the boardwalk. Years of running from the law, years of mistrust and suspicion held him back like chains. What if Caldwell didn't believe his story? What if the sheriff thought Jack was involved with the bandits? What if he took the baby and Jack never saw the child again? The questions buzzed in his head like angry wasps. But underneath them was a deeper fear, the fear of losing something that had given his life meaning for the first time in decades. Inside the saloon, Caldwell was showing something to the men at the table. Jack caught a glimpse of it through the doorway, a small photograph, worn smooth at the edges from handling. Even from a distance, Jack could see it was a picture of a young woman holding a baby. Ellen Caldwell and her son. The sheriff's voice grew quieter, more desperate. This is all I have left of them. My Ellen was always headstrong, always believed she could make a better life out west. I tried to talk her out of going, but... He trailed off, staring at the photograph like it might bring the dead back to life. One of the men at the table, a rancher Jack recognized, spoke up. We ain't seen hide nor hair of any wagon train, Sheriff. But if they came through this way, somebody would have noticed. What about survivors? Caldwell asked. Anyone new in town? Anyone asking strange questions or buying supplies they don't usually need? Jack's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Morrison's voice drifted from behind the store counter. Well, now that you mention it, Jack Merritt was in here a few days back buying baby milk and such. Thought it was strange, him being a bachelor and all. The world went silent except for the pounding of Jack's heart and the soft breathing of the baby against his chest. Through the saloon window, he saw Caldwell turn toward the store, his weathered face sharp with sudden interest. Jack Merritt, the sheriff repeated. He live around here. Got a cabin up Devil's Canyon way. Morrison replied. Keeps to himself mostly. But he paid with silver, which ain't like him. Usually trades work for goods. Jack felt the walls closing in around him. In a few minutes, maybe less, Caldwell would be riding up the canyon trail with questions Jack wasn't ready to answer. The sheriff would see the baby, would recognize his own blood, and then what? Would Caldwell thank him for saving the child? Or would he see a drifter with a suspicious story and a baby that didn't belong to him? Jack looked down at the sleeping infant and felt his world shifting beneath his feet like sand in a windstorm. The child's face was peaceful, trusting, completely unaware that its fate was about to be decided by men who'd never learned to trust each other. For a wild moment, Jack considered running. He could be saddled and gone before Caldwell finished his questions, could disappear into the desert with the baby and start over somewhere far from sheriffs and badges and the weight of other people's. But as he watched the child sleep, Jack knew he couldn't do it. This baby belonged with family, belonged with someone who could give it a real home and a real future. Not with a broken-down cowboy who lived in a 3-room cabin and didn't know the first thing about raising a child proper. The truth was a heavy thing, but it was the right thing. Jack adjusted the baby's blanket and walked slowly toward his horse, each step feeling like he was carrying stones in his boots. Behind him, he could hear Caldwell's spurs ringing against the boardwalk as the sheriff emerged from the saloon. "Excuse me," Caldwell called out. Jack stopped, but didn't turn around. The baby shifted in his arms, making a small sound that cut through him like a knife. "You Jack Merritt?" Finally, Jack turned to face the man whose life he was about to change forever. Up close, Caldwell looked even more worn down than Jack had expected. His face was mapped with lines of worry and loss, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd buried too many people he loved. "I am," Jack said simply. Caldwell stepped closer, his gaze moving from Jack's face to the bundle in his arms. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The desert wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "That's a mighty young traveling companion you got there," Caldwell said finally. Jack felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, teetering between truth and lies, between redemption and ruin. The baby's weight in his arms felt like holding his own heart outside his body. And in that silence, with the sheriff's eyes boring into his soul, Jack realized that some secrets were too heavy for one man to carry alone. The moment Jack placed that baby in the sheriff's arms, two strangers discovered that love could heal wounds deeper than any bullet ever made. The rain came down like bullets that night, hammering against the cabin roof with a violence that matched the storm raging inside Jack's chest. He sat by the dying fire, watching the baby sleep in the wooden crate, knowing that come morning, everything would change. Sheriff Caldwell's words echoed in his mind. "That's a mighty young traveling companion you got there." The way the lawman had looked at the child, the careful way he'd spoken, Jack knew the sheriff suspected something. It was only a matter of time before Caldwell came asking the hard questions Jack wasn't ready to answer. But as the night wore on and the rain turned to a gentle patter against the walls, Jack found himself thinking about the photograph he'd seen in Caldwell's weathered hands. A young woman with kind eyes, holding a baby that looked exactly like the child, now sleeping peacefully in his care. Ellen Caldwell had been someone's daughter before she became someone's mother. And Thomas Caldwell had been someone's father before he became a grandfather who didn't even know his grandson was alive. The weight of that truth settled on Jack's shoulders like wet wool, heavy and suffocating. How many nights had the sheriff lain awake wondering if his family was dead or alive? How many mornings had he woken up hoping for news that never came? Jack reached down and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The child's grip was surprisingly strong, those small fingers curling around his with a trust that made Jack's throat tight. "Your granddaddy's been looking for you," Jack whispered. "Been riding these trails for days, asking questions, and showing your picture to anyone who'll listen. He loves you something fierce, little one, even though he ain't never held you proper." The baby's eyes fluttered open at the sound of Jack's voice, those blue depths reflecting the firelight like pieces of sky. Jack found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. "But I love you too," he admitted, the words falling from his lips like a confession. "Didn't know I had it in me, but there it is." Dawn came gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt like the world holding its breath. Jack dressed slowly, his hands shaking as he buttoned his cleanest shirt. He wrapped the baby in the softest blanket he had and held the child close, breathing in that sweet smell that had become as necessary as air. The ride to town felt like traveling toward his own execution. Copper Creek was just waking up when Jack arrived, smoke rising from chimneys and shopkeepers sweeping dust from their doorsteps. He could see Caldwell's horse tied outside the saloon, still saddled, as if the sheriff hadn't slept at all. Jack dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The baby was awake, but quiet, those blue eyes taking in the unfamiliar sights with calm curiosity. Jack pressed a gentle kiss to the child's forehead, tasting salt that might have been tears. "Time to go home, little one," he whispered. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, like a judgment waiting to be passed. Jack had never been inside it, had spent most of his adult life making sure he never had reason to. But now he walked toward that door with purpose, each step echoing in the morning quiet. He paused outside, gathering courage from somewhere deep in his chest. Through the window, he could see Caldwell sitting at his desk, head in his hands, surrounded by papers and maps, and the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying impossible burdens. Jack knocked. "Come in," Caldwell called, his voice hoarse. The office was smaller than Jack had imagined, cramped with wanted posters and territorial maps, and the smell of old coffee and older sorrow. Caldwell looked up as Jack entered, and Jack saw the exact moment when the sheriff's eyes found the baby. The lawman went perfectly still. "Mr. Merritt," Caldwell said carefully, rising from his chair. "That's a beautiful child you got there." Jack's throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. "Sheriff, mind if I ask where you came by such a young one? Don't recall hearing about you having any family in these parts." The moment stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Jack could feel the baby's heartbeat against his chest, steady and trusting, unaware that its whole future hung in the balance of what happened next. "Found him," Jack said finally. "Found him in a wagon train massacre about 10 days ago, out in Devil's Canyon." The words hit Caldwell like physical blows. The sheriff's face went white, then gray, then white again. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but stopped halfway, trembling in the air. "Devil's Canyon," Caldwell repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. How many dead?" "All of them," Jack said, the truth falling from his lips like stones. 3 families. I buried them as best I could." Caldwell's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He sank back into his chair, staring at the baby with eyes that held a universe of hope and terror. "The families," he managed. "Do you remember, was there a young woman named Ellen?" "Ellen Caldwell Morrison." Jack nodded slowly. "She died protecting the baby. Bandits got everyone else, but they missed the little one. He was hidden under his mama's body when I found him." The silence that followed was so complete that Jack could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Caldwell's face cycled through a dozen emotions: grief, rage, disbelief, and something that might have been joy struggling to break through the darkness. "That's—" Caldwell's voice cracked. "That's my grandson." "I know," Jack said quietly. "Ellen was my daughter. My only child." Tears began to track down the sheriff's weathered cheeks. "She married a good man named Samuel Morrison. They were heading to California to start fresh. I tried to talk them out of going." Jack stepped closer, extending his arms. "Would you like to hold him?" Caldwell's hand shook as he reached for the baby, and Jack saw a lifetime of regret in those trembling fingers. The moment the child settled into his grandfather's arms, something magical happened. The baby looked up at Caldwell with those sky-blue eyes and smiled. The first real smile Jack had ever seen from the child. "Oh, my God," Caldwell whispered, fresh tears falling like rain. "Look at you. Look at how beautiful you are." The sheriff held his grandson with the careful reverence of a man handling the most precious thing in creation. Jack watched from a few feet away, his own eyes burning with tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. "I don't know how to thank you," Caldwell said, looking up at Jack through his tears. "You saved him. You saved my boy. Just did what anyone would do," Jack replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. "No," Caldwell said firmly. "You did what a good man does. You chose to care for someone who needed you, even when it would have been easier to walk away." Jack felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening after being locked for decades. "Sheriff, there's something else you should know. The bandits who did this, I saw them. 3 men, one tall fellow in a black duster. They rode east after the killing. Caldwell's expression hardened, but he kept his voice gentle for the baby's sake. "We'll find them. Justice will be served." He looked down at his grandson again, his voice softening. "But right now, this little one needs a home. Needs family." Jack nodded, even though each word felt like a nail in his coffin. Of course the baby would go with Caldwell. Of course the sheriff would take his grandson and ride back to wherever he'd come from, back to a life that didn't include broken-down cowboys with nothing to offer but calloused hands and an empty cabin. But Caldwell surprised him. "Jack," the sheriff said, meeting his eyes directly, "I've been thinking about what you said about finding him in that canyon. About how you've been caring for him all this time." He paused, bouncing the baby gently. "A child needs more than just one old man to raise him proper. Needs someone young enough to teach him to ride and shoot and be strong." Jack's heart began to beat faster. "I'm getting too old for this badge," Caldwell continued. "Been thinking about settling down somewhere quiet, maybe raising this boy the way his mama would have wanted. Could use a partner in that. Someone who's already proven he'd die before he'd let anything happen to this child." The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile, and almost too good to believe. "You asking me to help you raise him?" Jack asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "I'm asking you to be his family," Caldwell replied. "Same as you've been these past 10 days. Same as you were when you could have left him in that canyon, but chose to bring him home instead." Jack looked down at the baby, at those perfect little hands and that trusting face, and felt his broken heart begin to heal itself with golden thread. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I'd like that." Thunder rumbled outside, but it sounded different now. Not like violence approaching, but like the world washing itself clean. Through the window, Jack could see the rain beginning to ease and shafts of sunlight breaking through the clouds like promises being kept. Caldwell stood and handed the baby back to Jack, and in that moment they stopped being strangers. They became something more, two men bound together by love for a child, by the sacred responsibility of protecting innocent life. "What's his name?" Jack asked, settling the baby against his chest. "Ellen never told me in her letters," Caldwell admitted. "Reckon that's something we'll need to figure out together." Jack smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. "We got time for that. Got all the time in the world." Outside, the rain was stopping, and Copper Creek was waking up to a day that felt different somehow. Cleaner, brighter, full of the kind of possibilities that came after storms passed and the air cleared. Jack Merritt had ridden into that canyon 10 days ago as a man with nothing to lose. Now he was walking out of the sheriff's office as someone's family, someone's future, someone who mattered in ways he'd never dared to hope. And in his arms, a baby slept peacefully, surrounded by the love of two men who'd found each other through tragedy and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Sometimes, Jack thought, as they stepped into the sunlight, grace came disguised as the very thing you thought would destroy you. And sometimes, the family you needed most was the one you never saw coming.